Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, personnel and budget changes continue to roll across the Pentagon. A slew of top leaders are fired in a Friday night sweep, and budget cuts and further manpower cuts are considered across the military. Plus, staff reductions and the looming deadlines for the defense budget. There's a lot to get through in this week's panel discussion. Coming to you from the nation's capital, it's the latest in news and analysis from the Pentagon to the platoon, here on Defense News Weekly.
Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Leo Shane, Capitol Hill Bureau Chief for Military Times, coming to you today from our studio in Washington, D.C. Joining me today are Defense News Pentagon reporter Noah Robertson and Defense News Air Warfare reporter Steve Losey. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Appreciate you coming on here. It's been a tumultuous few weeks for the Defense Department. We saw the firing of C.Q. Brown, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, firing of Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the Chief of Naval Operations. Noah, talk to us about what this means both for Pentagon leadership and for the military, for the rank and file. Are they gonna see effects from this right away?
I think it's hard to know right now what the effects are really going to be because we're in uncharted territory right now. The Trump administration has made clear that those, even in the relatively or usually apolitical military, that do not agree with the agenda are off the books. They only want loyalty moving forward in the administration. And that's a huge change of mindset for a military that usually prizes independence from politics as a way to move forward. I mean, it's a cornerstone of American tradition there. That said, it's not even clear that General Brown or Admiral Franchetti are actually against the agenda in any reasonable way. It just seems that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was insufficiently inclined to believe that they were meritorious of their positions rather than what he calls diversity hires, despite there not being evidence to make that conclusion.
Just to really foot stamp this, this is not a usual thing. We do see a fair amount of turnover in civilian positions as we go from administration to administration, but these military positions are military. They're independent. This is held outside the place. So this is not. We haven't seen this in past administration changes.
No, it's a completely uncharted territory too. And just to foot stomp that even more, there have been past presidents who have thought about firing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This happened with Colin Powell heading into the Bill Clinton administration in 1992. But that was considered absolutely beyond the pale for those presidents entering, both because somebody like Powell was a very powerful figure in Washington and beloved by the public, but also because it was seen as infringing on the independence of the military. So they decided not to go forward with that.
So I guess the question for both of you related to that is, are we surprised that this happened? I mean, there had been some rumors, but as you said, this is kind of outside of the normal scope of what we consider and what administrations consider. Are you shocked it happened?
To a certain extent, no. Secretary Hegseth certainly made no secret before his nomination that he was not a fan of General Brown. He made comments in interviews and in his book where he kind of implied that C.Q. Brown may not have been qualified for his role. General Brown, to be clear, is a decorated F-16 pilot. He helped lead the air war that crushed the Islamic State.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about him and his qualifications. Is he? I know we've had General Milley post his stint as chairman of the Joint Chiefs become kind of a political figure. We had Lloyd Austin, who was the civilian Secretary of Defense, but had the military background. So I think there's some muddling now and some confusion of who's a political figure and who's not. Where did CQ? But you've covered him for years. You covered him from the Air Force side and then from the Joint Chiefs side. Where does he fit into this? Is he a political force here?
Not at all. He took pains to keep his leadership and his tenure at the Air Force outside of politics. He got criticized in recent months from some conservatives for what they perceived as his focus on diversity. General Brown is the first black service chief in U.S. history. That is true. He's a black pilot. He would talk about those from time to time, most notably after the George Floyd death. But and he would talk about diversity. But the vast majority of the time he spent talking was about on how to counter the threat from China. He authored a strategy called Accelerate, Change, or Lose on how to transform the Air Force. He had bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats for both his nominations. And let's also remember that President Trump himself nominated General Brown to be the Air Force Chief of Staff.
Yeah. And just to cut in there to add to what your point was, General Brown was clearly getting on board with the new administration's priorities. When he was fired, in fact, he was visiting troops who have been newly deployed to the southern border.
And I think that's part of the shocking, maybe surprise here, is that there didn't seem to be a conflict, even though there was some of that chatter ahead of time. There didn't seem to be any pushback from the chairman at the time. It didn't seem to be things. I do remember after the George Floyd incident and the protests and the national outcry, the speeches that he gave. I think it was a public message that he put out talking about his own racial identity and some of the effects that had on his career and stuff. And I remember that being a very emotional moment. But beyond that, I don't remember him being really a voice for diversity and inclusion as much as he was just as just a military leader who was charged with executing some of that during the Biden administration.
That's right. A key thing a point that General Brown started to get very criticized for by conservative figures was a memo that he and other Air Force leaders signed, I think it was about 2022, that was about recruitment goals, aspirational recruitment goals for the officer ranks in the service. That was characterized in some corners as him implying that the Air Force needed to get rid of white officers, which is not at all what the memo said. However, that is something that some conservative commentators return to again and again, and some lawmakers as a weak political weakness to criticize General Brown.
Okay. Well, along with those dismissals, we've also received word from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth that the Defense Department is looking to trim at least 5,400, I believe it is, civilian positions. We actually have a clip of the Secretary sort of outlining what his goals are for that.
This reevaluation of probationary employees is being done across government, not just at the Defense Department, but we believe in the goals of the program and our leaders are carrying out that review carefully and swiftly. Now, bottom line, it is simply not in the public interest to retain individuals whose contributions are not mission critical and to restore accountability within the federal workforce. Taxpayers deserve to have us take a really thorough look at our workforce top to bottom, and it will be top to bottom, to see where we can find and eliminate redundancies. Now, common sense would tell us where we should start, right? We start with poor performers amongst our probationary employees because that is common sense and you want the best and brightest. So when you look at headcount, we're going to be thoughtful, but we're also going to be aggressive up and down the chain to find the places where we can ensure the best and brightest are promoted based on merit. And then we're going to go out, we're going to put out a hiring freeze and take more time to identify on a performance-based standard who we're going to hire and reward hard-working employees who are central to the core warfighting mission. So we're going to take a little bit more time, make sure top to bottom we're doing a review. Those who we need, who are the best and brightest, are going to stay. Those who are underperformers won't.
So Noah, talk to me about what that means. Do we have any sense of who these folks are going to be, when these cuts are going to be, and what it'll mean for the Defense Department in terms of their workforce?
I think the clearest thing that we can say right now is that this is just the start. Right now, there's a wider government effort led by Elon Musk and his so-called Department of Government Efficiency from the White House to re-examine not just what America's government does and how to make it more efficient, but really to cut through all of what they see as government bloat, waste, fraud, abuse. These are allegations that they put forward. It's not substantive so far that they have actually proven any of these are waste, fraud, or abuse. That hasn't stopped them from moving forward with a chainsaw, which Elon Musk himself brandished at CPAC, the conservative gathering just last week. This is starting in the Pentagon right now with the initial 5,400 cuts. That's going to be the start of a much larger effort to root out what they see as unnecessary positions. And they're starting first with probationary employees, which means that these are people who were just hired and are still in training before they assume the full roles.
Well, except with the probationary employee thing, that can also mean folks who were just promoted or switched to another job. We're seeing this widespread in the Department of Veterans Affairs right now, where they've laid off about 2,500 folks or 2,400 folks who were in probationary positions. But now we're hearing a lot of those were folks who maybe already have 10, 15 years in and just shifted to a different job, shifted to a different department. And now it's not that they're losing folks who don't have experience, they're losing folks who actually know what's going on there and have cut them out because just really because of technicalities.
And the effect of that is that everyone feels like they're now skating on thinner ice. People in the building are wondering, am I going to be a target in the future? Is my position necessary? Am I 4 or 5 years away from retirement and they're going to want to cut my job before I get full benefits? People are now wondering whether they will be next. And that leads to a pronounced sense of anxiety that even I've sensed within the Pentagon.
When we come back, more from our conversation on budget and personnel news reverberating in Washington. Join us when we return.
Steve, I know you've been digging in really deep into what that means for the Air Force in particular. What are we talking about? I know they've looked at reorganizing some money and reorganizing some focus, but what would an 8% cut to Air Force programs mean right now?
So one thing that I thought was interesting is when Secretary Hegseth has discussed this, he's discussed cuts in the context of what he referred to as woke Biden-era policies, things like diversity, equity, inclusion programs, climate change programs, which he referred to as climate change BS. That's clearly been a target of ire for the administration, and they want to cut those out. However, if you were to cut 8% of the Air Force's budget, that would be $15 billion. Space Force, getting close to $2.5 billion. There's not $17 billion of DEI and climate change spending in the Department of the Air Force's budget. So what is the Air Force doing? They've been trying to cut older and outdated planes from their fleet for years, talking things like A-10 Warthogs, the attack planes that were heavily used in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's some F-22 Raptors that are older, they aren't combat capable, they're trying to retire those. And that's led to major clashes between the Air Force and the Hill over the years.
I was going to say, so why can't they cut those? These have been fiercely defended by folks on Capitol Hill, and you've got to imagine that as these come up again, even with Republicans backing President Trump, backing some of these Department of Government efficiency initiatives, there's still going to be these fights over, are you actually going to take the A-10 out of my district? Are you actually going to take these jobs out of my district to have savings and reassign it somewhere else?
Which is funny to see this happen as an administration-only effort so far. They can fight about this as much as they want internal to the Pentagon and the White House, but that doesn't change the battle lines that exist in Washington more permanently, which is between those institutions and Capitol Hill.
Yeah. One thing that the dispute between the Air Force and Congress has thawed somewhat in recent years, and the Congress has allowed the Air Force to start retiring some of those A-10s. The service is hoping to have the fleet retired by the end of the decade. However, the F-22s is kind of a multi-year dispute now. So the Air Force hopes to accelerate the divestment of some of these older planes. There's a lot of there's some F-15Cs, some of the earliest F-15s that are really kind of ragged right now. So yeah, it'll remain to be seen whether the administration goes for more aircraft cuts as part of this effort.
So how long were those fights to get to that point where Congress is actually agreeing with those? That took several weeks, right?
Yeah. They hashed it out over the weekend. No.
I mean, that is the timeline we're suddenly looking at here. They're looking at the fiscal 2026 budget. They want to have these cuts. They want to put it in place. Congress is going to start talking about what those levels should be in just the next few months here. And for a pretty significant turn to be cutting, again, new administration, new priorities. You understand there are going to be some adjustments, but if they're really talking about pulling 8% from every department and reassigning it to border security, do we even know what those priorities are going to be besides border security?
We don't exactly know what the priorities are, and just to show how much uncertainty there is around this, Steven Feinberg, who's a billionaire investor who has a lot of holdings in defense companies and is nominated to be the number 2 in the Pentagon, the deputy secretary who is usually in charge of managing all of these cuts, or would be in charge of that, including both budget and personnel. He appeared before Capitol Hill this week for his confirmation hearing. Democratic senators asked repeatedly about these. What do the personnel cuts mean? What do the budget cuts mean? And he had no answers, both because he's not in the position he's nominated to yet, but also just because he didn't seem to know what the clarity would be. And I think that's where we are right now. We're in the early stages, and we're not necessarily sure, even for those in the positions that they're going to be managing these cuts from, what they will lead to.
So who do we think has those answers at this point? Because we've talked about this some. There is a level of frustration, not just at the lowest levels here, not just at the rank and file folks, but even among higher levels of Defense Department, VA, other agencies, of just not knowing who's making these calls. I mean, is it just Elon Musk and the White House? Is it? I mean, how well do you think Air Force officials have read it? And how well do you think any senior defense officials have read in? Or is this edicts coming from the White House and they're just trying to field the balls as they bounce around the infield?
Well, I think there's going to be more turf battles because of that exact dynamic that you bring up. It is largely right now an effort being run by Elon Musk and DOGE to cut these positions. That's the personnel area. But to a certain extent, there's also buy-in from OSD, the Secretary of Defense's office. That's being led at the highest rungs of the Pentagon within Secretary Hegseth and his team. But it also has some input from Capitol Hill, the Senate Armed Services Committee, and the Republicans who are running that now after they secured a majority last year. So there are inputs coming in from different areas, but as Elon Musk's team becomes more and more influential and moves without caution, that's going to lead to more friction between these traditional Washington entities like the Department of Defense and the team that he's running ad hoc or unofficially running ad hoc out of the White House.
I think there are some Air Force programs that are going to see a boost out of this reprogramming. Okay. The Secretary Hegseth's memo put collaborative combat aircraft off limits for cuts. These are the autonomous drone wingman program that the Air Force has been working on for F-35s and the future NGAD, Next Generation Air Dominance fighter platform. It was a big priority for former Secretary Kendall. I expect that to continue going forward. Nuclear modernization is also off limits. That will most likely include the Sentinel ICBM that's going to replace the Minuteman IIIs, which its future anticipated future costs are going way up. But also perhaps the B-21 Raider, the new stealth bomber. So I think those are a few examples of programs that might see some boosts as a result of this.
When we return, our financial expert is back with her latest tips on knowing the difference between private and federal student loans. Stay with us. Welcome back. Do you know the differences between federal and private student loans? If you're considering higher education, it's time to pay attention. Jeanette Mack from Navy Federal Credit Union is here to walk you through how they work. Check it out.
If you or your child is college-bound, figuring out how to pay for it can be overwhelming. If you don't qualify for scholarships and grants, there are 2 other options, federal and private student loans. So what's the difference? First up, federal student aid, aka federal student loans, are funded by the government and come with great benefits like fixed interest rates, so your rate and payment stay the same for the life of the loan, and options like loan forgiveness or deferment are available. On the flip side, private student loans come from banks or credit unions, and the loan and interest rate are given to you based on your credit. Keep in mind, federal loans might not cover all your expenses. In that case, you could fill the gap with a private student loan. Before you go this route, try to secure federal student aid. Complete the free application for federal student aid to see what you qualify for. Then explore private loans if you need to. Compare both and see what works best for you. As always, talk to a trusted financial advisor before making any major financial decisions. Whether it's with a federal or private loan or both, head to college with confidence.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage of military and defense topics, stick your head out of that submarine hatch and look for militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more headlines. And to be the smartest soldier MP on guard duty, sign up for our early bird brief, compiled each morning to bring you the most recent headlines. Lastly, if social media is where you collect open source intelligence, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X. And if you get your news by endlessly scrolling with your thumb, we're on TikTok, so go find us there as well. When we come back, the conclusion of our conversation on the latest major headlines from the Pentagon. Stay tuned.
Okay, so easy final question for both of you. What happens next? Where are we at? Where are we at with this? I mean, look, there has been, when President Trump nominated Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he said that he was going to be a disruptive, unconventional force. So I think we've seen that in the last few weeks. Can this pace keep up? Are we expecting it to, do you feel like this is just the initial blitz here of get everything in, shock and awe on a policy level, or should folks be prepared for 9 more months, 3 more years of this kind of just rapid fire, unpredictable policy decisions at the Defense Department?
I think the first budget proposal coming up in the next couple of weeks is going to be very telling. I think that's where we're going to see how a lot of these statements, these new priorities, are going to be put into practice in reality. I think that's going to be very telling.
It'll be interesting to see whether that budget proposal does come in within the next couple of weeks. It's been getting increasingly late each year, but with the proposed 8% cuts, we might see a further delay to that as well. I think a crucial point right now is that as these cuts go forward, you may have a congressperson bristling at the idea of A-10s being retired from the production lines in their district. What we should be watching right now is what happens when DOGE and these new people entering the administration start to come from the sacred cows in Congress. That may lead to a little bit more pushback from a Republican Party to this point that has been very pliant to what the administration has wanted.
Well, and it should be said, it's not unusual, again, with the change of administrations for those budget conversations to get pushed back a little bit. That annual defense authorization bill, sometimes that gets shifted. However, if it's June 1st and we still don't have a budget, July 1st, then it's a whole different conversation, a whole different fight here. So listen, gentlemen, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for the conversation here. If you'd like more of our coverage on this and other topics, you can find all of our work on militarytimes.com and defensenews.com or on any of our social media channels. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.